Often, the general term at risk refers to students whose characteristics or experiences make them more likely than others to fail in school, and they may also have disabilities. Students whose primary language is not English, or ELL, sometimes are considered at risk, and they may need assistance on their educational journey. They may attend bilingual education programs or classes for English as a second language, ESL, to have opportunities to learn English while also learning the standard curriculum, or they may receive assistance in their general education classrooms. As reviewed in this course that we are taking together, the identification process of ELL in Pennsylvania is clearly outlined in the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Code and Regulations Basic Education Circulars in regard to students with limited English language proficiency, or LEP, and ELL. First, as we know, a home language survey, or HLS, is administered to identify students with a primary language other than English. Based on the responses to the HLS, students must then be assessed for potential placement in a program, unless, of course, they meet special exemption criteria, such as certain grades and test scores. Next, a screening and placement process is conducted via the WIDA Access and WAPT, or WAPT, a state-mandated English language assessment. As a result, a letter is sent home for parental consent, and if given, students are placed within an appropriate educational environment. However, some ELL also have disabilities, physical or mental impairments that could significantly limit life activities, from autism to hearing and vision impairments. In these situations, both English language instruction and special education are provided. The individual education plan, or IEP team, must consider the need for English as a second language, or ESL, instruction as they address all students' needs related to the provision of the free appropriate public education, or FAPE. In determining the students' needs, IEP teams must consider both special education services and ESL instruction simultaneously, as appropriate. All procedures for the screening, evaluation, IEP, and the provision of services and/or instruction must be in compliance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and the Pennsylvania Chapter 14 regulations. It is highly recommended that the IEP team for an ELL with disabilities include an ESL professional familiar with the student's language needs, as well as the nature of his or her disability, or at a minimum that the IEP team receive input from an ESL professional when appropriate. If a student is identified as an ELL, then the IEP team will check the limited English proficiency under special considerations on Part 1 of the IEP. Any special considerations identified must be addressed in the IEP. Research indicates that states and districts face a variety of issues related to ELL, including referral and identification, service delivery, staffing, data collection, and parent outreach. Much of the research has focused on the identification process and has shown that there are patterns of both overrepresentation and underrepresentation of ELL in certain disability categories of special education. The first and most significant reason for the tendency to over-identify ELL as in need of special education is that the assessment of proficiency among ELLs is filled with difficulty. Assessment is a complex process, obviously, which requires consideration of multiple factors, including cultural and linguistic learning and application. A study by the Center for Applied Linguistics outlines a program model which would address phases to move toward in special education referral. In general, Phase 1 would address the school environment, which would include ELL-appropriate instructional strategies, from thematic instruction to collaborative learning models, as you would imagine. Phase 2 would focus on early intervention, where ELLs would be assessed in native language and English to determine language dominance and proficiency. A team approach would be used to execute clinical teaching cycles, modify instruction, and monitor progress. The third phase would be the special education referral. Of course, parents' rights would be one of the utmost importance in the phase, as school districts must notify parents of a child's assessment and placement in special education programs. Imagine the challenges for those students who are English language learners and also have learning disabilities. Unless children with disabilities develop native language competence, they will most likely have problems learning a second language and will experience difficulty with cognitive development as well. Despite the limitations of currently available assessment tools and lack of classification research, there are resources on best practices for identifying and serving ELLs with disabilities. However, research is less conclusive on how to reliably identify ELLs with high incidence disabilities. One study posed the question regarding ELLs who have been properly identified learning disabled. Will they never exit the ESL program? Research shows that the severely learning disabled students may never exit the program, in fact. However, it would be advantageous for the team of professionals involved in the identification process to develop appropriate exit criteria for the ELL as part of the initial process.
As previously mentioned, English language learners tend to be either over or underrepresented in special education across America, depending on the area and the school district, but nationally they are underrepresented. Ideally, for any given ethnic group, there should be about the same proportion in special education as there is in the school's general population. For example, if Chinese children would comprise 10% of your school's population, let's say, they should make up approximately 10% of your special education enrollment. Research has shown that districts with smaller LEP student populations identify on average more of their LEP students for special education services, while districts with more LEP students identify on average less of their LEP students for special education. Many school districts, especially those in the southern United States, are at risk for having an overrepresentation of ELL students in special education programs. Factors thought to contribute to the problems of disproportionate representation include the lack of effective instruction in the general ed programs, the lack of effective pre-referral interventions, and the use of inappropriate or inequitable assessment procedures. Another reason thought to cause overrepresentation is that the dropout rates for English language learners are 15 to 20% higher than the overall rate for students. This lack of academic success possibly leads to more referrals and more ELL learners in special education. It has been shown that English language learners with the least amount of language support are most likely to be the ones referred for special education. ELLs receiving all of their instruction in English were almost 3 times as likely to be in special education as those receiving some native language support. ELAs have also cited significant challenges in distinguishing whether they're actually disabilities in ELL students or if those students are just having language acquisition difficulties. Underrepresentation and underidentification are often the cause of schools being very sensitive to the possibility of a misdiagnosis due to ELL difficulties, not necessarily a disability. As a result, ELLs with special education needs are sometimes left behind because of this sensitivity.
An answer found on PA's ELL website sums it up in one word: no. ELLs may be eligible for special education services only when it has been determined that a disability exists that is not solely due to the lack of instruction or proficiency in the English language. Therefore, special education designation equals special education services, no exceptions. But there are services available for these students for which a special education designation is not required. According to the 1997 amendment of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or better known as IDEA, it clearly stated that students are not eligible for services if their learning problems are primarily the result of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Similarly, a statement in the Journal of Quality and Fairness in Pennsylvania's Public Schools Education and Law Center, limited proficiency in English is not a disability, so no child should be assigned to special education or early intervention services simply because he or she is an English language learner. According to a 1970s U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare memorandum, it is a violation of the student's civil rights to include and label ELLs as special needs based on the criteria of their English proficiency. Including ELLs in special education without justification and proper evaluation or designation is discriminatory. In fact, there have been court cases to prove this mis- or overrepresentation. For example, Diana v. State Board of Education is a court case that was filed due to the alleged misrepresentation of Mexican American children in Monterey County, California, as mentally retarded based on the IQ test scores administered in English. This legislation called for schools to identify racial and ethnic disparities in special education placement. Also, Larry P. v. Riles is a court case that brought attention to the classification of African American students in special education and deemed mentally retarded based on the single assessment of an IQ test that did not take into account the cultural background. However, there have been services and laws enacted to provide help to ELLs in schools without the need of being designated in special education. The Bilingual Education Act of 1968, including its memorandums and amendments, provide federal funding to local schools for innovative programs for students with limited English skills. The court case Lou v. Nichols resulted in the HEW issuing requirements that schools offer bilingual, multilingual, or transitional bilingual education for eligible participants. So, services for the further and better education of ELLs are available, and they do not need to be designated in need of special education to receive them.
There are specialized teams that in research they have started developing for bilingual education. These special education assistant teams are going to be made up of teachers who are going to be specially trained and have specific expertise in this field of working with students who are in the bilingual education program and can deliver necessary instruction to maximize efforts in schools. Very few school personnel have expertise working collaboratively with students who speak another language and also have experienced learning difficulty. With this need rising in schools all over America, specialized training is now being developed for teachers to be better prepared for these special students. In the article that I found, it broke down the different phases and the need and how you make the team and the training. So I'm going to go over that information next. In present times, there are more bilingual students entering our school districts, and some even who are going to have the need for an IEP and special needs. The problem becomes then, how do you serve this student and get them the services they need for both being bilingual and having said disability? This is where bilingual special education teacher assistance teams come into play. The purposes of these teams are to help support teachers while they design and implement instructional programs for linguistically diverse students with learning problems. The team can be made up of any personnel in the school, whether it be their ESL instructor, their special educator, a regular education teacher, or any other certified teacher that is in the building.
But this assistance team is not going to be involved in the referral or placement process of said student. Once the team's formed, it's going to be formed by the school principal. And the first training session, the team members are just going to basically go over personal information, their name, address, their area of certification, just to get to know each and everyone's background. Then they're going to meet again. The second training session will be modeling collaborative processes and refining the function of the team as a whole. Basically, set roles, how the team's going to work. The team is going to develop their own referral forms and procedures that they all will follow. And then through those third and fourth sessions, the team will have practice working together collaboratively during simulations, basically practice with fake students and situations, to see how their referral forms and procedures work. Changes can be made during the practices, and they can always be made afterwards down the road if new problems arise. And the team will also participate in weekly team meetings, discuss procedures, and practice new techniques that come up that they can use. There are some problems that they've found in research with using these teams. Team member roles sometimes are not as defined as they need to be. The special educator tends to be the remedial role most of the time, but sometimes the ESL instructor could take that role. When roles change, how the educator looks at it and takes on that role, and it could be different from the last person who had that role since roles change. Overall, there's consistency issues. In the bigger picture, these teams can fulfill a need in school districts if implemented properly, but working collaboratively is always going to be an uphill struggle. In conclusion to my research that I've found, ELL students are disproportionately referred to special education, so you will see these students in special education classrooms all over. So special educators do work with them to access these students and place them and make sure that they're getting what they need. And I basically just wanted to highlight a unique approach that I had never heard of before and didn't really think of a special educator being a part of the ELL process in that way. And I just thought it was really interesting, these bilingual education assistance teams. So hopefully you learned a lot from this.